Welcome back to Wrong Sports, and I hope you're ready because I am extremely ready for the college football season, especially ready for the 12-team college football playoff. Took them more than 100 years to get this playoff system, as before this, we had the polling system for a national champion, which was really bad. College sports fans had to go through the entire season, then through the bowl game, and then we had to wait maybe a couple of hours or maybe even a day or so to find out what sports writers would vote in the AP poll and who they would vote for a national champion, and then who the coaches would vote because they had their own poll. Sometimes they voted the same, but most of the time they didn't. Plus, for about the first 30 years of these college polls for national champions, they were voted on before the bowl games, which made it even worse. So I will attempt to rectify it with this list of the years in college football that needed a playoff system, and I'll explain more about that in just a moment. But before I get into this video, make sure as always you are subscribed to the channel below. Ring the bell too so you can get updates on brand new videos that I will be dropping throughout the college football season. Plus, check out and subscribe to my Patreon, patreon.com/wrongsports. You can also check it out in the link below for exclusive video and content that I will be dropping throughout the rest of the year. And also, please like and share this video. Share this channel with other college sports fans. So before I get to the seasons that needed a 4-team or maybe even an 8-team playoff, I have some seasons to mention where all we needed was for bowl tie-ins to go away and just give us number 1 versus number 2. And it happened a few times, mostly in the 1980s and 1990s. First, let's go to 1983, where we just needed Texas to play Nebraska since both were undefeated. On the day after New Year's in 1984, though, Texas lost to Georgia and Nebraska lost to Miami, and Miami was picked as the national champion. If some bowl game pushed to have Texas versus Nebraska instead of sticking us with the bowl tie-ins that we had, it could have given Tom Osborne his national title a little earlier, or maybe even Texas a national championship. In 1990, I just want Colorado versus Georgia Tech in a bowl game. That's all we needed. The Fiesta Bowl, the Citrus Bowl, whatever you wanted to do, just so we could have had number 1 versus number 2, instead of both of these teams playing other teams and winning bowl games. So nothing really changed, and Colorado ended up winning the national title with 1 loss. I made a whole video on this year. I actually made 2 videos on this year because this season was so crazy week to week. I will put the link above so you can check it out. And here's another egregious example of, can we just have number 1 play number 2 in 1991? Because Miami and Washington were the clear 2 best teams that year, and instead of Washington playing Miami in a bowl game, Washington would go to the Rose Bowl, Miami would go to the Orange Bowl. Both teams won. Washington did make the final vote close due to that Rose Bowl win, but Miami still won the national title. It would be kind of a split national title though, so really nothing was accomplished this year either. So let's round out the first part of this list by making fun of a bowl system that was supposed to give us number 1 versus number 2 in a bowl game for a true national champion. It was first called the Bowl Coalition from 1992 to 1994. Then they changed the name to the Bowl Alliance from 1995 through 1997. Only thing was, there were a few years where it never gave us number 1 versus number 2 because the Rose Bowl wasn't a part of it. So the Big Ten and Pac-10 champions were never a part of this system, rendering it completely useless. And here were the times where all we needed was to have a Big Ten champion play Nebraska. In 1994, Nebraska were undefeated in the regular season for a second straight year and the number 1 rated team going into the bowl games, while Penn State were also undefeated. And since they were new to the Big Ten and the champions of it, they were chosen to go to the Rose Bowl and use their high-octane offense to beat Oregon. Meanwhile, Nebraska had to come from behind to beat Miami, but they still won, and they were named national champions that year, even though, again, we should have had Nebraska versus Penn State. Then in 1997, Michigan and Nebraska were the 2 best teams, and if it wasn't for the Rose Bowl, then we'd have Michigan's great defense, led by Heisman winner Charles Woodson, versus Nebraska's amazing offense that were scoring 40-plus a game. That would have been an incredible game. Instead, we had Michigan play Washington State. They won it, but it was close. Then Nebraska beat Tennessee and Peyton Manning in his final college game by 20 plus points. In the end, the AP poll picked Michigan for the national champion, while the coaches poll picked Nebraska. So again, nothing was solved. This would lead to the BCS system that would start in 1998, and everyone hated that too for a while. Then we got the college football playoff finally. For the first 100 years or so of college football, bowl tie-ins got in the way of us seeing a national championship bowl game. Right around the 1980s, though, the Fiesta Bowl was really able to schedule top teams for a national title bowl game because they were able to schedule whoever they wanted, as they didn't have a conference tie-in. So in 1986, they were able to schedule Miami versus Penn State, the top two best teams in the nation, so we actually got a national championship game that year. That was one of the few times where the bowl system worked, but a lot of times it didn't. And it wasn't that we just needed 1 versus 2, we needed like a 4-team playoff, or maybe even an 8-team playoff for the national title. And that is what I'll be going over now, the years that needed a college football playoff of 4 teams or more. I'm going to be doing it in chronological order, and I'm going to be starting it with the 1927 season. This is one of my favorite years in college football because it was so wacky, and I'll be making a 9-team playoff. Yes, you got to keep it with me a little bit here. If you look back at this year, 5 teams were given the title of national champion by sports writers and pollsters, so a playoff this year would have been needed, at least a 5-team playoff. I'm going to put a few more teams, though, in. This is the final ranking from the Dickinson poll this year, which was one of the oldest polls in college football, and if you look at this chart and to see how close all of these teams are, it's no question why I say this was a great season in college football. So to start my playoff, I would love to have a Big Ten championship. So I would have Illinois play Minnesota, and they would play an unbeaten Texas A&M in the next round. The reason why I gave Texas A&M a bye in my playoff was because Minnesota and Illinois played 8 games to Texas A&M's 9, and also it's annoying that Big Ten teams at this point didn't play more than 5 conference games. Also in my playoff, I'd have Notre Dame play Georgia, and Georgia Tech play Yale. I did this because, again, this is where you got to keep it with me a little bit. Yale played and beat Army, but lost to Georgia, while Notre Dame beat Georgia Tech, but Georgia Tech would beat Georgia. So these games are all good play-in games for these 4 teams, and one of them would have to play the winner of my final quarterfinal game between Pitt and Army, Yale. It's my pick for national champion when I did my How the Year Was Won 1927, which you can check out above or in the description below. And you can see why I picked Yale over other unbeaten teams this year. So again, this year was really crazy, and one of the years where we could have had an 8 or 9 team playoff. And I'm going to be hanging around in the 1930s for these next 2. 1932 was a year where there was only 1 bowl game, and they tried to schedule a best of the East versus a best of the West. The only thing was there were a few others that they forgot. First off, USC were undefeated. They played the unbeaten and 2-tied team from Pittsburgh. I'm going to leave that game in my playoff, but I'm also going to be adding some teams. First off, I'm going to have Michigan play Purdue, who were both unbeaten and didn't play each other in the regular season, even though they were both in the same conference. So let's just have them play here so we can find a true Big Ten champion. Finally, one more playoff game needs to have the undefeated and unscored upon Colgate team this year. They were robbed of a Rose Bowl bid, so I'm going to be adding them into my playoff here to play the winner of the play-in game between unbeaten Tennessee and unbeaten TCU, because why not? Also, Colgate were rated higher than both of these 2 teams, so that's why I'm saying it's a play-in game to play Colgate. And if you want another year where there was a head-scratching national champion, look no further than 1936, because Minnesota was named the national champion even though they lost to Northwestern and didn't win the Big Ten. Northwestern, meanwhile, were ranked number 1 until they lost their final game versus Notre Dame. There was an unbeaten team in LSU and Alabama this year, and a good Western team in Santa Clara. Santa Clara would go to the Sugar Bowl and beat LSU, so it really muddied up the end of the season. So we're going to fix it with a 5-team playoff. Since Northwestern beat Minnesota already, I'm not going to add Minnesota in the playoff. Instead, I will have Northwestern have a bye to the finals, while I'd have Pittsburgh, who were a great team and only lost a game by a slim margin, to face Santa Clara, and LSU to face Alabama because I want to see an SEC title game. And those winners would face off, and then the winner of that would play Northwestern for the national title game. Again, a big crazy fantasy, especially in 1936. The next year that needed a playoff was 1940 because there were 4 undefeated teams at the end of the season, and voters picked one to be the national champion that didn't even play in a bowl game. That would be Minnesota. Meanwhile, Stanford completed an undefeated season, beating Nebraska in the Rose Bowl, but more about this in a moment. At least, though, there was a bowl game between 2 undefeated teams as Tennessee faced Boston College in the Sugar Bowl, and Boston College won that game and got a huge win, but it didn't matter because voters would choose Minnesota as the national champion. Minnesota, like I mentioned, chose to not go to the Rose Bowl because a lot of Big Ten teams at this point were not traveling for bowl games. And if Minnesota would have went to the Rose Bowl, it could have given us a national title game, because Minnesota beat Nebraska, who went to the Rose Bowl to play Stanford, who were undefeated. And again, all we needed was for Minnesota and the Big Ten to be convinced to send their champion there, and we would have had a number 1 versus number 2 game. Up next is 1947, and I was going to have a 4-team playoff in 1946, but really all I want is for Notre Dame and Army to play with overtime or to have played again in 1946 to find a true national champion, because they were the 2 best teams that year. The next year, though, 1947, is a year that needed a playoff. First off, Notre Dame were named the national champion. They did beat USC and Army, but like most older Notre Dame teams, they didn't play in a bowl game. The number 2 team was Michigan. They were also undefeated. They wiped the floor with all of their Big Ten opponents, and they would go to the Rose Bowl. They would play USC and beat them. But it would have been better if Michigan played another team in the Rose Bowl. Like, how about the undefeated Penn State? Penn State were 9-0 with 6 wins by shutout and would go to another bowl game against another unbeaten team in SMU. SMU were 9-0. They gave Texas their only loss that season, and they also beat UCLA. But in their final game, they tied a mediocre TCU team. SMU and Penn State played each other in the Cotton Bowl to a 14-14 tie. But a 4-team playoff with number 1 Notre Dame playing Penn State and number 2 Michigan playing SMU, and then those winners squaring off, would have been a better ending to this season than instead of what we had, which was 4 unbeaten teams. The 1951 college football season was a season of change, as many schools were either decreasing their athletic budget and getting rid of football teams, or they were putting even more money into sports and their football team. This year also saw a sports writers poll that picked a national champion only for them to lose in the bowl game. So to fix that, I've got a playoff for this season. First off, Tennessee were ranked number 1 and would play in the Sugar Bowl versus Maryland and lose. And I'd like to keep that game because the winner of that would have a bye and play the winner of these next 4 teams. Michigan State were also undefeated this year and didn't go to a bowl game as they were still independent, so they really didn't have a bowl tie-in. But I'd put them in my 4-team playoff to play another undefeated team with a Heisman winner in Princeton. This was the last year an Ivy League player won the Heisman, as Dick Kazmaier was the leader of the Princeton offense, as well as the leader in total offense that year. So a matchup with the best offense versus the best defense in Michigan State would have been a great playoff game. The other playoff game I'd have would have Georgia Tech, who were unbeaten with a tie, versus Illinois, who were also unbeaten with a tie. The winner of Georgia Tech and Illinois would play the winner of Michigan State and Princeton, and then the winner of that would play versus Maryland and Tennessee. So that's a better playoff than what we had this year, and I also would have loved to have seen Princeton play Michigan State, or maybe even Tennessee at the end of the year. That would have been cool. But again, this is all fantasy because the Ivy League would have never sent Princeton to a bowl game because they never sent their teams to bowl games or postseasons. We're going to the 1960 season next. This was another season like 1927 where there was a handful of teams that should have been picked national champion or at least given a shot. When the season ended, the AP poll picked a champion after the regular season. and they picked a one-loss Minnesota as the champion. Since they beat Iowa, but then lost to Purdue, they would still win the Big Ten and go to the Rose Bowl. But I take the Rose Bowl game of Minnesota versus Washington as one of my playoff games. Along with that, I would take the Orange Bowl between one-loss Navy and Missouri, and I'd include Iowa versus Ole Miss for my playoff games because Iowa had the best schedule this year and only lost to Minnesota, while Ole Miss were unbeaten this year and really given no credit. They were number 2 and pretty much could never get higher than that. In my fantasy playoff here, I would allow the winner of Iowa versus Ole Miss to receive a bye to the finals to meet the winner of the Rose Bowl and Orange Bowl winners for the national title. The 1960 season had so much chaos in it, and the bowl matchups caused even more chaos for the pollsters because Minnesota would lose in the Rose Bowl, and Missouri had a controversial loss. Even though they were undefeated, they actually lost their final regular season game to Kansas, but then it was given back to them. It's a whole rigmarole. Again, if you want to hear more about the chaos of this season, just check out my How the Year Was Won 1960. I'll put a link above, also in the description below. Let's go to the 1970s, because the 1973 season saw the end of this regular season have 6 teams remain unbeaten, and after the bowl games were over, there were still 5 teams unbeaten. There were quite a few ties, so if Michigan and Ohio State had overtime in their game, and if USC and Oklahoma had overtime in their game earlier in the season, it might have been a different end to the season. But let me show you the playoff I have, because it's going to be a 6-team playoff for this year. Since Notre Dame played Alabama in this playoff, we will keep it that way. Michigan and Ohio State will play each other in this playoff, and there will be a winner. Again, this is a fantasy, so I'm adding overtime here. Finally, Penn State, who were undefeated for the 3rd time in just about 6 years, would play Oklahoma in the other playoff game. And I would give a bye to the winner of the Alabama-Notre Dame game, as that was just a higher-rated game, and just because. Penn State and Joe Paterno would probably have loved this playoff system, or the 4-team playoff back in the late 1960s and 1970s, because they might have gotten their national title a little earlier than they did in 1982. So there you go. There are some of my years in college football that needed a college football playoff. Tell me what other years you think I'm forgetting. I know I'm forgetting a few others, so tell me in the comments below. Again, make sure as always you are subscribed to the channel below, and check out my Patreon, patreon.com/wrongsports, so you can help out the channel there. Have a fantastic rest of your day.